Why do people die? What happens when people die? And what can be done for the survivors? I'm Jenny Schroedel, and I'm a hospice chaplain here in the Twin Cities. I specialize in grief support, and I work for Optage Hospice with Presbyterian Homes and Services. For me, my greatest fear was death. Working in hospice has been the cure. So I was the third born in our household. My brother Garrison, the firstborn, died at 2 weeks. He was born with severe spina bifida, and after he was born, the doctors told my parents to leave him in the hospital to die. And they did this. They had such profound regret about having left him that he spent his last few weeks of life alone. And that loss infused the atmosphere of my home, which in general, I had a happy childhood in lots of ways, but loss was always somewhere in the backdrop. And because of Garrison's death, grief, loss almost felt like my natural habitat from a very young age. So I was comfortable being with grieving people. And I was also very curious about the afterlife. I think from a really young age, I had this sense that heaven was real. I wasn't raised going to church, but I was just quite sure that heaven was real. I can remember as a child staring up at the sky at the light coming through the trees and just thinking, yeah, I think heaven's real. I see that light coming down and one day I'll be there. And so there was a sense of loss and there was a sense of possibilities beyond this life. I always knew his name, but I've never seen a photo of him, and I've always been curious. As a child, when my parents would talk about Garrison, they would cry. We would go to the cemetery. I don't know if it was every year on Memorial Day, but frequently go to the cemetery and put flowers on his grave, and they had a lot of emotion about that. And so I was just afraid to talk about it. I wrote a book later on about infant death, and while I was working on the book, I had a dream that I was in a house, and the house had a room that I had never known was there, and I found my way into the room. And in the room, there were pictures of my brother Garrison. There was his birth certificate and his death certificate, and I was looking through these things. And then my dad came into the room and said, "What are you doing in this room? You're not supposed to be in this room. You got to get out of this room." And so there was a sense that I had from a young age, and even as I was working on my book, that this was like the forbidden topic. Through middle school, that interest was there, but it was really in high school when it was kind of intensified. And I think at that time I started thinking, this might be my line of work somehow, something around death and grief. When I was 16 years old, there were a series of deaths that occurred in my life. All those questions that had always been part of me became an area of intense interest and study. I did my senior project on near-death experiences, read hundreds of accounts, was very fascinated by this. What I learned was that many people that have near-death experiences often lose their fear of death. I was afraid of death from a very young age, in a certain way a little bit haunted by this idea of death, and then read these accounts and started to think, there's more. It's not just death. There's something beyond death. And I just started to kind of go deeper into it, but I didn't know what I was going to do with an interest in end of life. I went on to college. I studied journalism and history, and then I took one class which was called Death and Bereavement, and in that class I learned about hospice care. We read an essay about a family that cared for their mother at home, and After she died, they said prayers, washed her body, dressed her for burial. The love and the sacredness that surrounded her in those moments absolutely piqued my curiosity about hospice care. Frederick Buechner wrote that you find your vocation at the intersection of the world's great hunger and your own deep gladness. And I already knew that. There was some kind of gladness or joy or satisfaction in being with the grieving and being with the dying, and that this was the world's great hunger. It's something everybody goes through. Everybody needs support with this at some point in their life. And then we moved to Hawaii. My husband, John, is an Eastern Orthodox priest, and he was working on his PhD at the University of Chicago. Our godfather had been overseeing a mission in Kona, Hawaii, and he reached out to John and he said, would you consider going to Kona? I think the people would love you, you would love them. This was very interesting to us because we had met in Hawaii, and it was like we had an invitation to go back. And so we decided to leave Chicago. My youngest was 1 year old and my oldest was 6 years old. And we went for 6 months, unsure that we could stay in Hawaii, unsure that we could support ourselves financially, unsure that that small mission community had the stability to have a priest. And within those first few months, we knew we couldn't leave. We moved into an apartment that was right across the street from Hospice of Kona. And I'd always had a curiosity about working in hospice. And then the director of bereavement services called me, I think because she was looking for somebody to speak at their circle of remembrance, and she was thinking my husband could speak. He had spoken there before. And then she started talking to me about my own interests, and she actually said, we have a position opening in grief support. I think I knew within the interview I was going to get the job, and I walked out of Hospice of Kona, and I was like, I am finally doing the work that I've meant to do all my life. We cared for patients in lava tubes, in coffee shacks. I was always learning and growing, and I never knew what was going to happen next. And it was as though I stepped into the most natural experience of my life. I guess the two most natural things I've ever done are having my 2 daughters and becoming a hospice chaplain.
I'm John Schroedel, and I am the husband of Jenny. She's been doing grief support and care kind of naturally. Maybe it's a strange thing. For her, it's a pretty normal thing, since high school at least. The nights away were the hard part, I think. She would do a lot of groups in the evening because a lot of people work during the day, and so the time to have groups for grief and bereavement counseling, that kind of thing, is in the evenings. Working at a hospice, she'd come home and she likes to talk about her work all the time. And so the kids and I had a quota, only so many stories about death every night at dinner. And I think it was pretty generous quota, maybe like 5. But then we cut her off and we try to change the subject.
So I was sitting with a client. We had just opened the grief center, and this was a local woman in her 20s. And she is talking about the loss that she's grieving. And suddenly the grief center starts to shake. And it was an old coffee shack, kind of on the side of a cliff. Beautiful building, but precarious, and it's shaking. And in Hawaii, there are lots of earthquakes. So it was difficult for me to assess if I should be afraid. I looked at her face. She was terrified. And I was like, we got to get out of here. So we went out to the street and we were watching the signs sway with the earthquake. Then we went back in and the aftershock hit. And the building was okay, but what had occurred is the Kilauea volcano has a large lava lake, and the lava lake had drained in that moment. This was 2018. When the lava lake drained, there was such a massive amount of lava that just disappeared from the Kilauea volcano. What occurred in 2018 is At one point, 29 fissures were erupting. 700 homes were lost to that lava that was flowing out of the volcano. Lots of people had cracks, like huge fissures open under their homes. It was a crazy time, and the air quality was really poor. We were struggling to breathe. Our youngest daughter was in a school that was open air, and we thought, I don't think we can do this to her lungs. I don't think we can do this to ourselves. I used to see a client at the grief center, and then I'd be so exhausted during the session that I would think maybe in between, before my next session, I could just lay down on the floor for an hour because it was so hard to breathe. And I have a lot of emotion around the fires. Really feel for people in California, especially who've had to leave places because of the fires. Now we've got some fires burning in Minnesota as well. It's all very familiar to me, where something changes in your environment and you have to make a major life change as a result of that. It's really painful.
We had a sense that we would move back to Minnesota at some point, and she was concerned to help take care of her parents, who were getting more elderly and more in need of help and care. So we had that maybe a 5-year plan on the radar, but the volcano went off. It was a long eruption, and it's really hard to predict a volcano. Where we were, it wasn't the lava that was the problem. That was exciting, although about 800 homes were destroyed by lava and covered. But where we were, it was the air that was the real problem, because all the almost pure sulfuric aerosols from the volcano would directly kind of be in the breeze coming up. And so we evacuated our home, actually. It wasn't a mandatory evacuation or anything, but everyone was getting sick from it. And it was thick in the air. I mean, and I got sick from it, and it just went on and on and on. So went on for 3 months, basically. And after a couple months, we were thinking, well, what are we gonna do? Because people don't really have air conditioning there. You can't shut the windows and, effectively really filter air. So where was, our daughter gonna go to school? Because the school is all open air. They only had 3 walls on a lot of the classrooms, for example. So we thought, well, maybe it's time to go.
The struggle was that we had a community that we loved there. We had a home. We had built a life there. And then I was professionally doing the most interesting thing I've ever done. Opening this grief center was the most interesting thing I've ever done. So we were so engaged with our life. So actually the struggle was, I'm not sure we get to choose. So I had heard before we moved to Hawaii that there was kind of you could call it like a myth or a legend, but it's a widely held belief in Hawaii, is that when you are meant to live there, like a person that's coming from the mainland, if you're meant to live there, the land itself accepts you and things just kind of fall into place. And that's exactly what happened to us with jobs, the home, the kids got into a great school. It was just really clear, like we were meant to be there. And when it's time for you to go, it's as if the land itself rejects you. Everything kind of starts to fall apart. That was a little bit what it felt like for us. It was a sense that the land itself was, sending us away, like we had to go. It was the first week in the newly opened grief center when the eruption started. One of the things I learned is that so many times in life, circumstances will force a change that you might not feel ready for. And that was certainly the case. We chose to come back to the Twin Cities because both my parents were in fragile health. I started working for Presbyterian Homes and Services almost immediately. Within the first month, I was working for Pres Homes. Just as I started, my mom broke her femur. And she went into surgery and she had 2 strokes. And this was the beginning of the end of her life as well. So what was reassuring to me was that although I wasn't ready to leave Hawaii. I was clearly needed here. The timing was perfect. The day that she broke her femur, she was alone in the house except for me. There would have been nobody there if I was still in Hawaii. And that was always an anxiety that I had, particularly while caring for the dying in Hawaii. Many people were waiting for their adult children to come from the mainland to be with them as they were dying. And I was supporting them, knowing that my parents were back on the mainland. I felt that in some way my personal and professional life were separating, and I needed to bring them together. I needed to not be that one that was creating anxiety, but come back and be there for my parents.
You know, our time on earth is short, and our job is to love people, and hopefully we find some meaningful ways to love people, and ways to use things that have been entrusted to us, our gifts, that it can be a beautiful thing, and that we can build a lovely community and have beautiful relationships with people. And it's pretty simple, you know. The two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor. There's many ways to do that.
My mom had no fear of dying. Once she reconciled herself to the reality of it, she faced it with eyes wide open and just profound curiosity. She clearly knew that she was going to be out of pain and she was going to be at peace. My father, as a type 1 diabetic who had always feared dying young, and I was afraid when I was a child that he was going to die. It was absolutely unspoken in our household, but that was his fear. When he started to actually move into that season of his life where he was dying, he was unable to shift as my mom was, where my mom just kind of understood it. He had the dementia and he didn't lose the terror. You know, so he would call me and say things like, my blood sugar is high, and if you don't get the nurses to give me more insulin, I'm gonna die. And he was already on hospice, you know, but he couldn't quite grasp that he was dying. So he was fighting against dying until almost his last 2 days. I had traveled with my family to Switzerland. My dad was on hospice, but he had been relatively stable. We were going through customs here in the Twin Cities, and I got a call from the Deerfield, which is a senior living organization where my dad was living. And the nurse said, your dad seems to be having trouble swallowing. I had not gotten a single call while I was traveling. He had been relatively stable, but as soon as I heard he was having trouble swallowing, I thought, it's happening. And he had waited for me. And so I got out to the Deerfield. Things were changing for him. He started getting weaker. He's in his bed and he says to me, Jenny, get me my shoes. And I said, why? He said, because I have to exercise. So he wanted to put his tennis shoes on and keep on exercising. He was holding on to life and fighting against death. So the night before he died, he was very anxious. I asked him, you know, are you okay? And he said, I'm really not. And I think it was that fear of death and his increasing knowledge that he was going to die that he couldn't quite articulate. Something that I had done for many patients over my years as a hospice chaplain is a small ritual of anointing. And so I did this service for my father that night when he was so anxious. So I prayed over his hands and thanked God for all of the things he'd been able to do with his hands in this life, all of the kind acts and all of the writing that he'd done, all of the reading, his feet, all the walking that he'd done in this earth, and prayed that he would have the courage to step from this life into the kingdom of heaven. Prayed over his heart, thanking God for all the love that he had given and asking God to give him courage to take that love with him now in his heart as he left. Prayed over his mind, prayed over his eyes, thanking God for all the things he'd seen in this life and asking God to prepare him to see the glory of the kingdom, his ears to hear the heavenly chorus. As I did this prayer service, my dad became calmer and calmer. And when the prayer service was complete, he said something like, "I'm okay now." And those were some of the last words he ever spoke. He just kind of became very quiet and very calm, and then died the next morning. I'm so grateful that I made it home and that he waited for me. It was hard to imagine that he could come to peace because he had fought against death so hard for his entire life. And what a gift that night he did come to peace, and that I got to witness it and be part of it and bring all of my learning as a hospice chaplain into that moment with me.
So we're at a cemetery now, and I don't think it's strange to be at a cemetery, or it's not a morbid thing for both of us, and we really share that there's a lot of brightness in these thresholds. It's just a natural part of living. That's part of the joy in hospice work or bereavement work. Maybe hospice work more, because you're helping people almost like a midwife sometimes over that threshold, and you see things. I mean, sometimes horrible things, but many times wonderful and bright and a little bit mysterious things. And it's a joy and a privilege to be with people at these moments of transition that are sometimes very vulnerable, and try to be simply a presence of love and hope, and just a little pointer toward the love of God in dark times for people. Yeah.
When I was there, I worked at Hospice of Kona, and one of the families that I cared for, when the parents, their 17-year-old daughter had died, when they first came into my office, they showed me this picture. The mom showed me this, it was on her cell phone, and she explained to me that it was from her daughter's memorial. Her daughter had died as a result of drinking and driving, and there was a photographer that just happened to be swimming at this beach. This is Kua Bay on the Big Island of Hawaii, and he saw helicopters come, and the helicopters started dropping plumeria. So this is the custom in Hawaii, to have a flower drop and to scatter ashes in the ocean. And as soon as he saw the helicopters, he didn't know whose memorial it was, but he just started taking pictures. So he captured this, and my client asked me to bring this back to Minnesota, because she said, "I want you, when you're back there, to help people understand that death doesn't always have to be dark and gloomy. We can remember people in ways that are beautiful and full of life and light." She said that when these flowers were falling from the helicopters, it was actually a drop of 300,000 plumerias and orchids. And she said it was like it was raining kindness. And her daughter always used to say, "Scatter kindness." And that has become really part of my personal, kind of a personal slogan, just scatter kindness. I carry that with me. One of the really significant and very moving things for me working for Hospice of Kona was that many of our hospice patients lived in houses with 3 generations. And I always thought that was beautiful, where there were, young grandkids running around, and then there were their parents, and then the grandparents. So a grandparent is dying in the home, and there's the whole swirl of family life happening around them as they're dying. And there's all of that care and all of that support. Families prioritized. And coming back here where individualism is really prioritized. And a lot of people live by themselves and die alone here. Nobody should have to face these things alone. Walking with fear drives me to improve. This is the interesting mystery of this, is that I feel very comfortable with grieving people. I know this is my gift in the world, to support people with loss, and there was always fear. I often have a sense of how will I help this person? Walking with that fear and that sense that it's always going to be new, I could never be too prepared to support people, keeps me open to continually learning. I think being with the dying and being with those who grieve has heightened my sense of wonder at this world. Similar to when I had children, when they were small and I was watching them discover the world, it was as though everything, the colors were so bright and the flowers were so beautiful and animals were so interesting, and my own sense of awe at the world was heightened by my children. Similarly, caring for the dying and those who grieve helps me see how incredibly precious each moment is and how beautiful the world is. I don't know how much time I'll have. Nobody does.